You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have a returning guest, Perry Marshall. Perry is an interesting guy for several reasons. So he's really well known in the marketing world. That's how I first came across him. I learned a tremendous amount. And then Perry's interest turned to science, and in particular evolutionary biology. And he ended up writing a book called Evolution 2.0, which explores the divide between Darwinism and intelligent design or creationism. So what I've seen Perry do really well is transition from one type of person to another. He's gone from, again, being a great marketer. He's applied that to being not only a great scientist, but marketing the ideas that he espouses. And he's, one of the huge things he's done is he's attracted $10 million of prize money for a prize that he'll describe shortly. But that feat for someone in the science world is incredible. So I wanted to have him on because I think more than anyone I know, he's uniquely positioned to talk about how scientists that have good ideas and have great research and things like that can get themselves out there and market themselves. So that's why. And Perry, welcome. How you doing?
Thank you. It's great to be here. And this is actually a very interesting topic. And I've learned a lot of new things in the last few months for many different reasons that I think you even flavor this a little more, probably making this a little different conversation than if we'd done it when it was originally scheduled. So, this is going to be very interesting.
Well, tell listeners about your prize. What's it for? And a little bit about what the experience of trying to attract that much money was like, because that's a big accomplishment to have done that.
So the Evolution 2.0 prize came from me going down the evolution rabbit hole. And we did a previous podcast, and people can go hear a whole talk about evolution. But I resolved that I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And evolution, that was as it was described to me at a surface level, didn't really make sense to me as an engineer. And I said, well, either the biologists know something the engineers don't know, or the engineers know something the biologists don't know. And what I really found out was that the cells and organisms know something that none of us know, which is how to self-modify. Now, the deepest question that I could get to was, how do you get a code? Since the genetic code is a code, and since all living things are built using that code, I thought it was very logical to ask the question, well, where did that code come from? And what I found out was nobody knows. In fact, nobody really has any idea. And what people said was that David Hume or Charles Darwin or Richard Dawkins or any number of different people have solved the design problem in biology. And what I found out was, well, if you're talking about where life came from, nobody has solved the design problem in biology. Darwin didn't, Hume didn't, Dawkins, none of these guys. But then you have this impasse where you have various flavors of design people that say, well, God did it. And then you have the scientific process, which doesn't have any way of dealing with God, and where, there's no scientist that can say, well, God did it, that settles it. Let's just stick that in a scientific paper and let's go out to lunch. And so it's like, so what I would say to a creationist is, well, even if you're right, you could be right, but that doesn't really help the scientists do more and better research. It's kind of a dead end. He can't collect a paycheck for, it doesn't slice the problem any further. But then what I'd say to, people on the other side is, you don't get to make up a story about a warm pond and a lucky lightning strike and a happy chemical accident. But I kept inquiring into this, and I started to realize, if somebody actually did solve this, it would be the biggest engineering discovery ever. It would be a bigger deal than the invention of the transistor. And since right now what you've got is these two sides just, throwing pies at each other and insulting each other and talking past each other, how about we put money on this problem and we say, look, this has not been solved, but the first person who does solve it gets $10 million. And what that does is it firmly establishes what questions we still don't know the answer. And that's very valuable.
Yeah, and so, you didn't just have this as pocket money, so you had to raise it. And
yes,
from what I've seen, you raised this from people on both sides, not just one.
Well, most of the money came from my clients. I deal with all kinds of interesting business people, and I pitched all kinds of people, but the people that said yes were people that, for the most part, had already paid me money for this or that, or, came to a seminar or bought some consulting or whatever. And so, and it took a long time from the day I first met with a prospective investor to actually having $10 million committed, was about 7 years. And this is a very weird investment. It's certainly not an illogical investment because, if somebody discovers it and we patent it, then, they don't have to write the $1 million check until the patent is granted. Nevertheless, it is not anything like, buying a piece of real estate or stocks and bonds or anything. So it took quite a while. And I would say the crowning achievement of this was that the $10 million prize announcement I was invited to give at the Royal Society in Great Britain, which is the oldest scientific organization in the world. Isaac Newton used to be the president there, and then it was the video was on Voices from Oxford, and the story was in the Financial Times 2 days later. And so we now have the largest prize of fundamental science research in history. And I'm very excited about that. And it's opened many doors for many conversations. I've gotten invited to both public and private meetings of scientists. And the deeper I go, the more fascinating this gets in terms of the inner workings of how the science community really works, what some of the problems are. And then your question, well, so how does a scientist market themselves in the 21st century? So here we are.
Yeah, from what I've seen, I'll give a little bit of background. So your Evolution 2.0 book was my first read into the evolutionary biology world. And because it was so clearly written, it's not like a scientific paper. I mean, I've slowly acquired the skill of being able to read scientific papers and journals and understand what they're saying, which took a while.
Yes.
So the book is super clear. I have gone through it 5 times, and I've taught it to my kids. It's that clear, but it also opened up my journey to talk to hundreds of scientists and learn and see what their plight is about. And what I've heard over and over and over from these scientists is, well, you have to do the research that gets funded because scientists don't have money. So, running a lab is like running a business, and you have to apply for grants. And if you don't apply for the things that will get funded, you're wasting your time and you can't do the research you really want to do. But it's like golden handcuffs, because you take money from the NIH or whoever it is, you have to research what they want in the way they want, and you're narrowed, you're forced into this silo. And I see this like, I don't know, this trap that a lot of scientists are in. So what are your thoughts around it?
Wow, Rich, you figured it out. You're reading my mind. This is a problem. This is a big problem. Okay, so let's expand on what you just said. You're exactly right. You can't. So first of all, yes, a research lab is like a little company. In fact, there's all kinds of websites. There's Smith Lab or Johnson Lab or McGillicuddy Lab or whoever it is. Somebody. And basically, it's like 5 to 10 to 15 grad students or postdocs and 1 or 2 or 3 professors, and they get like, let's say, $1 million a year from NIH or NSF, and and if they publish some good papers out of that, then they'll get some more funding, and the thing can go on. And if you don't get funding, you're screwed. And the problem is you can only get funding for stuff that's in the current zeitgeist. And you can only get funding for stuff that matches the current theories and is in vogue. And there's always multiple theories about almost anything. I know a scientist, for example, who, when he got tenure, he said, well, I could keep running the dog and pony show, and I could keep running this lab, and I could keep going on the road and raising money, or I could actually get something done. And he said, well, I'm going to actually get something done. And so he closed his lab and he stopped applying for grants. And, well, let's just say his department head was really not very happy about it.
Yep.
Now, he has since gone on to do what I would consider to be some incredibly important work, but he paid a price for doing that. And the primary mechanism of doing that was becoming an encyclopedia of other people's research rather than doing his own, which is probably fine. But it's a tough road, and there's 2 layers to the problem. So one layer to the problem is getting the funding from the funding agencies, but the other part of the problem is getting it published. And I have asked numerous scientists, so how bad is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the problem of publishing and peer review in terms of doing the research that you really think is important and being able to get it out there? And last 2 people I asked, one scientist said it's a 9 out of 10, and the other one said it's a 10 out of a 10. In other words, a very acute problem.
Well, I can give you a quick bumper sticker. Peer-reviewed is peer-approved. So there's all the politics of who's going to approve you, and if they don't approve you, why don't they approve you? Because of the science, or because there's some other agenda that they're beholden to?
Well, so peer review means that the editor is going to have a group of people, maybe 3, 4, 5 people, usually anonymously read your paper and comment on it. And if they like your paper, then it'll get published with some modifications. And if even 1 or 2 of them don't like your paper, it probably gets shot down. You'll typically get to name 5 peers that you would like to have be reviewers and 3 that you don't. That request may or may not be honored. But okay, so why is stuff accepted or rejected? Well, the very simple problem is that it's very, very difficult to tell in advance what is good science. Okay, because you come up with some model of how a protein folds, or some different take on how the Big Bang works, or something like that. It could take years or even decades for somebody to definitively prove that your theory is wrong, let's say, or to come out with a really, really strong alternate theory that's clearly better. So a lot of times it's very ambiguous, and then there are schools of thought, And if you don't belong to a popular school of thought, then you're part of the out club, and you're not going to get funding. And so the 80-20 rule applies to science public, and there's a handful of dominant science publications and publishers like Elsevier, and journals like Science and Nature and PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. If you can get a paper published in one of those journals, you're in the in club. But that's harder than getting into Harvard. And then if you have a fringy theory or something that's not in vogue, you could get it in a third tier or fourth tier journal, but that's a little bit like kissing your sister. And so it's tricky. If you have a considerably different view than everybody else, you may have a lonely career.
Are you saying it actually would hurt your career to be published in certain journals?
Well, it could, but it's more like it's kind of like if you wanted to get a job at Hewlett Packard, would you want to have graduated from Southeast Community College in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Oh, it'd make it harder to get the job there, right?
Probably make it harder, okay? So it's tough. Now, here's another thing to think about. Let's say you're a grad student or a postdoc and you want to be a professor. Well, what do you want people to find when they Google you? Well, if you want a job as a professor, then you want your nose to be clean. You want some of your publications or things that you've worked on in your lab to have gotten published in major journals with your name on them. You want to not be associated with any controversy. You want to not have anybody be thinking that you're religious. And you need to be somebody who's not going to rock the boat. And in my opinion, most of those add up to a not very good scientist.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is what does that do to a publication itself? So if I want to get into these top journals, how am I intentionally or unintentionally altering what I'm researching and how I'm talking about it, et cetera, to try to get into these journals and be accepted there?
Well, I think it's a very sophisticated version of writing newspaper articles and headlines to get clicks. But it's much, much more sophisticated than now. And I'm not joking about that because in academic publishing, you have something called impact factor of a journal. And if you Google the name of any scientific journal, Google Scholar or Google itself will tell you the impact factor. And the impact factor is basically, it's an index of how many citations of your papers you've gotten divided by the number of papers that you publish, something like that. Okay, and so there's journals with high impact factors where their papers are cited frequently, and there's journals with low impact factor where the citations are not frequent. And keep in mind that Google itself was modeled after the citation system of scientific journals when Google started. And that turned out to be a better way of ranking websites than any text that was on the page of the web page, right? So that became Google PageRank. So journals optimize for what internet marketers would call PageRank. They don't necessarily optimize for what's genuinely good science. And it's just like, Yahoo News does not optimize for what's the truest or most useful thing that you could possibly know about the world. They optimize for, Trump getting the most, Trump saying something ridiculous, and you get clickbait headlines and you get fake news and stuff like that. And that problem, which is a problem of reducing everything to measurements and numbers, which measurements and numbers are not the truth, they're just measures of popularity. A lot of editors will just default, they'll go, well, this paper will get cited a lot if we publish it. Well, the only way for a paper to be sure that a paper is going to be cited a lot is it's saying what people want to read in the first place.
Yeah, this all sounds self-reinforcing. The top journals select the publications that the papers that will be most cited. Therefore, they're the most attractive to be published in. Therefore, they're the ones that it's self-reinforcing. It sounds like.
Yes, it's what business people call network effect, right? It's just like Uber, eBay. eBay gets more sellers, which attracts more buyers, which attracts more sellers, which attracts more buyers. Same thing with the science publication, right? Same thing with the impact factors of the journal, right? So it's very, very 80-20 or very 90-10, and it's a bit of an echo chamber. Now, I can say this with total confidence that it's true because I've gone very, 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 very deep into evolutionary biology, and I know a lot of the literature, and I know there's all kinds of things that you find in the literature that are demonstrably false, and they just keep getting repeated over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead, Rich.
So I wanted to, this is useful, but instead of just saying reporting on the state of the misery, any tactics or strategies or ways that you've thought of that could help, scientists that really want to get their work out there and believe that it's, groundbreaking stuff to do so, to get more fame, to get their publications cited, to get in these journals, how do you, I don't want to say game the system, but how do you game the system? Any ideas?
Well, what I think I would be a study in how you do this because of my prize. I had to get judges because otherwise, credible academic people where nobody could reasonably question whether or not the judging of my prize is going to be fair. Now, the fact is, I'm an electrical engineer. I've designed stuff for years. I went to school. I know what a code is. I can recognize a code when I see one. Technically, I don't really need, but socially, I need judges, right? So I ended up with George Church from Harvard, Dennis Noble from Oxford, Michael Ruse from Florida State University, and I approached a ton of scientists about being a prize judge. Most of them would not touch it with a 10-foot pole. The only ones that would touch it were rock stars, or let's call them, you could also say emeritus professors whose ongoing success is not dependent on whether certain people don't like them. Okay,
right,
so George Church is a rock star in genetics. I mean, Time Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people of 2017. He's published 400 papers. He's probably he's one of the 5 most famous geneticists alive. Okay. Well, he didn't have any hesitation about it. I said to him when we were discussing it, I said, George, if you don't like controversy, do not do this. And he goes, Perry, everything I do is controversial. I'm trying to create Jurassic Park at Harvard. Don't worry about it. That's fine. Okay. This is what he said. Dennis Noble is a renegade. He has defied the neo-Darwinists fiercely. In fact, they won't fight him anymore because they can't win. They know that he will rip them to shreds in a debate, and they've all been given invitations to debate him, and all the invitations have been turned down. Well, Dennis is a physiologist. His research does not depend on his opinions on evolutionary biology, and so he doesn't care. He just wants to tell the truth. So no problem being one of Perry's judges. Michael Ruse, Michael's always espoused unpopular positions and always been fine with that. But your typical scientist can't afford to do that. So what am I saying? If you have a view that is not in the current zeitgeist, you need to get the endorsement of somebody who's bulletproof, who will vouch for you. You have to make friends, and I find these are usually emeritus professors, that's academic lingo for retired, okay? And they also, I've also found the emeritus guys, they have time to go read and study and explore. They're not on a ferocious treadmill of just having to do the same stuff over and over again, run their lab, write more grant proposals and all of that. And so they have more time and space to think. I would say that the typical professor is so busy that he doesn't have time to think.
Yeah, I've noticed. I can tell when I've gotten to the friend level with an emeritus professor, because they start emailing me papers. That's their way of showering their love on you.
That's right. That's love from a scientist. Hey, I'm working on this paper, and don't share it with anybody, but tell me what you think. And look, exactly. They've been working on it for the last 8 months. It's their baby, and they have slaved over every single word of it. And another thing is that talking to civilians in the public about science is not particularly honored among scientists. If you'll notice that most scientists do not have a blog telling the world all of the, why the general public should be interested in this latest discovery about protein. They don't usually do that. They kind of live in their own clique. So if you decide to go write books that are aimed at popular readers, it may raise some eyebrows. I mean, it's not like seriously frowned upon, but it's almost like, so why are you spending your time talking to all those people? It's almost go ahead.
Yeah, here's a question. So how do you become a Neil deGrasse Tyson or a George Church or an Atul Gawande? How do you still maintain your dignified professionality, your scientific chutzpah or your scientific clout, but still talk to the public and be popular like that? How do you become a popular scientist?
Well, the way you become a popular scientist is you get really, really good at writing and communicating and explaining. I mean, there are a lot of people that like to hear science clearly explained, and that's why people go to Neil deGrasse Tyson or people like that. Now, George Church is a rock star because he's a maverick, renegade, crazy madman experimenter. He's a real life mad scientist who's extremely smart and has just been on the bleeding edge of genetics for 30 years, 40, I suppose. And now he's more of a rock star in the science community. Tyson is not, okay? There's some people that kind of are both, like Stephen Hawking, but that's a little rare. Richard Dawkins is immensely popular, or has been. His popularity's waning, I suppose, but he's not particularly respected by scientists. He's kind of a sellout. And so there's really a wide range of, whether these people are respected by both crowds or just.
What do you think is the motivation or the set of motivations of hardcore scientists? What do they really want? Like, what would their dream be if they could have it?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One of them is they just like discovering. They like, when they're in their lab and they're trying stuff and surprising things happen and they're in flow, and maybe they're the first person to have ever observed some particular thing. That is exhilarating. And then another motivation that's, I think, a little more, common to everybody is they want recognition for making these discoveries. They want it to get published. They want it to be in, Journal of the American Medical Association or what have you. They want to be, hopefully, well, maybe I could be the next Watson or Crick or Hawking or Ampere or Volt or Isaac Newton or miniature version of the above, right? Okay, maybe I'm not Isaac Newton, but I could be the Isaac Newton of protein folding or RNA synthesis or something like that. Or maybe I can make a discovery that will hugely impact medicine or healthcare or cancer research or what have you.
So maybe a good idea would be again, it's funny, it's analogous in the marketing you teach, but become a niche celebrity, to become the Einstein of cancer, or become the again.
And it wouldn't even be the Einstein of cancer. It would be like the Einstein of liver cancer, or the Einstein of prostate, or even some. I mean, there are so many sub special. They go miles deep. Usually, when you go to a scientist's webpage, they are so deep in some field of specialization that it is difficult to even try to explain it to a layperson. They're literally 4 or 5 levels deep in specialization, and they may be dealing with a particular enzyme in the kidney, and they've been studying that for 10 years.
Do you think that's a good thing, or is it too reductionist, too specialized, and why do they end up that way, so many scientists?
Well, yes, I do think often it's too reductionist, but it's the only way to get funding without butting heads. So marketers know this very well. Category of 1. You want to be the only person who does what you do, right? Okay, you don't want to be butting heads with 10 other people that also sell pizza on the same block. Well, scientists are the same way. And so it's very rare, and well, for good reason. It's how they get funded, right? It's like, well, if you're one of the top 3 people in kidney enzymes, then you're almost certain to make a, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is most scientists don't really have time to read outside their specialty, and they just have to take everybody else's word for it. And frankly, like the typical physicist or chemist or what have you, they get most of their ideas about evolutionary biology from Barnes and Noble or Amazon the same way everybody else does. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but they're certainly not getting to the bottom of things. They're just trusting the kind of general consensus opinion of what they hear a lot of other scientists say. They don't actually, and scientists don't like to, start stepping on each other's toes in fields they're not expert in, because that's not taken too kindly. That just gets you enemies. And so, everybody just kind of stays in their cubicle. And 1 in 50 will have a really broad sweeping knowledge of an entire discipline.
Well, I was just going to tell you that, I've interviewed probably easily 500 scientists, and they're always saying things like, well, I'm not an expert in that. So that's how they avoid answering it, or they literally don't want to speculate, or they won't speculate, or they can't speculate, or I don't know what it is. But that's what I'm. And
mostly they shouldn't. But they know that these fields are so deep and complex, and they know that the truth is so usually far from the surface, it's deep down there somewhere, that there is no upside to speculating about things outside your field. It could get you reamed in public, and that would be very bad. Then somebody Googles you, and this guy got in a tiff with an expert, and this guy's not an expert. Why does he go do that, right? So this is another reason why fields have to be reformed by outsiders, right? So in my case, I researched this stuff until, everything in Evolution 2.0, I was absolutely sure was, and I put it out there. And as far as I can tell, it's still absolutely correct. There haven't been any significant corrections or rebuttals. No, he didn't explain that right. There's very little of that, because it's right. But it takes a long time to get there.
So I guess, science is no different from many other endeavors. It's constrained, and it's censored, and it's money runs it, and interests and politics and all that run it. And I just wonder if there's, is there more insight on how to navigate that world successfully, so you're not just, a no name that is working in a lab for 30 or 40 years and on one enzyme, and that's the end of you.
Well, I'm needing to wrap this up, but I'll give you a couple thoughts.
Sure.
So Lynn Margulis did not get very much funding from the government. And some of her funding came from going out and giving speeches and lectures and funneling the money into her research. And she did it any way she could get it done. Barbara McClintock had people above her who believed in her research despite the fact that it wasn't popular with most of her colleagues. Some people managed to, so like if you can get a chaired professorship, which is basically like extra money with some street cred attached to it, it gives you the freedom to go do things that your colleagues don't do. But essentially it's, whether it's through the way that you structure your research or the way you structure for your career, you could almost think of it like your best friend is an alternative source of income or an alternative source of funding. Maybe some people can do corporate research, but have enough space to do stuff on the side. Have your side project, your skunkworks project. That can be the time. I think you have to think entrepreneurially. I think within the confines of the system, it's kind of depressing. But if you can just accept that it might take a renegade 10 or 20 years to get their ideas accepted, and you're okay with that, then you just get on with it, and eventually time can prove you right. Certainly was the case with me. So yeah, well, hey, it's been great being on here. This is really fascinating, more interesting than I thought it would. And the questions you're asking are right along the lines of what I've been thinking about anyway. So, Rich, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Last thing. How can people get your Evolution 2.0 book, and how can they find out about the prize?
Yes, go to evo2.org, evo2.org, and the prize is there's a link to the prize on the website, and Evolution 2.0 is on Amazon, and it will change the way
you're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs.
Thanks for coming. Thank you so
Until
much.
I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.